The signal came in at 3:47 in the morning, station time. I was not awake. I was not supposed to be awake. I had been on duty for 19 hours before that, managing a routine calibration of our deep space arrays, and I had finally fallen into my bunk with the particular relief of someone who has earned their sleep. Then my communicator buzzed. Then it buzzed again. Then Dora Vasic, a junior analyst who had been with the Signal Authority for exactly 8 months, called my personal line and said 4 words that changed everything. "Commander, you need to see this." I did not argue with her. Something in her voice told me not to. The signal room smelled like cold coffee and recycled air when I arrived. Dora was standing at her station with the expression of someone who had found something they were not sure they were allowed to find. Her screen showed a waveform, long, repeating, broken into irregular clusters that looked almost like breath. She had been running it through decryption models for 6 hours. 47 of them had returned nothing useful. The 48th, a model she had built herself, based on mathematical patterns found in distress behavior across biological species, had returned something very different. 2 words, repeating, in a frequency structure that no human had ever transmitted. "Help us." I stood in front of that screen for a long time. Then I pulled up the origin coordinates. The signal was coming from a system 6.4 light-years away, a place our passive scans had only faintly touched, a civilization we had never spoken to, never visited, never even formally acknowledged. The Velarath. They were asking for help. The UN Security Council met within 48 hours. I was not surprised by how fast they moved. Humans have a particular reflex when someone calls for help. We move toward it before we have time to think about whether we should. It is not always smart. It has gotten us into trouble more times than I can count. But it is ours. And that morning in the signal room, watching those 2 words repeat on Dora's screen, I was grateful for it. The decision was not complicated. The Velarath had sent a distress signal. We were going to answer it. The debate was not about whether, it was about how fast and with what. The answer to both questions was, faster than ideal, and with less than we wanted. 3 ships were assigned to the response fleet. The Resolute, a survey frigate that had been retrofitted with weapon systems originally designed for asteroid deterrence. The Cascade, a slightly younger vessel with better sensors but a crew that had never seen anything more dangerous than a meteor shower. And my ship, Meridian, which was the best of the 3, which gives you some sense of how modest our resources were. Admiral Chen briefed me personally before departure. He told me we might be flying into a war zone. He told me the situation on Velarath Prime was unknown, the enemy unknown, the tactical environment unknown. I told him that was fine. He looked at me the way people look at you when they are not sure if you are brave or simply not paying attention. "Humanity has been flying into unknown situations for 10,000 years, Admiral," I said. "At least this time someone asked us to come." We launched 11 days after Dora Vasic heard 2 words in the dark. The crossing took 11 weeks in subjective time. Faster than light travel, despite what it sounds like, is not instant. It is long and quiet and gives you a great deal of time to think about what you are heading toward. I used some of that time to learn my crew. Lieutenant Haruto Mase was my weapons officer. He was former Japanese self-defense force, compact and deliberate, with the habit of checking his equipment 3 times before he trusted it once. He was professionally calm in the way that only people who have genuinely been afraid learn to be. The calmness was not the absence of fear. It was what fear looks like when it has been trained into usefulness. I trusted him immediately. Dr. Fen Okoro was our xenolinguist and our only civilian. She had spent 15 years studying communication patterns across 17 known species, and she spoke in a way that made you feel like every word was chosen carefully, which it was. She told me on the 2nd day of transit that she was not trained for combat situations. I told her that neither was anyone else before the first war they were ever in. She gave me a look that suggested she did not find this as reassuring as I had intended. Chief Engineer Walczak had been keeping ships running since before I had graduated from the academy. He was large, unhurried, and deeply skeptical of anything that had not been proven under pressure. He called me Commander, never Yara, and when he said it, it sounded like a statement of fact rather than a title. I liked him enormously. 6 weeks into the transit, I sent a query to Galactic Relay Beacon 7, an automated diplomatic communications node that logged all interstellar transmissions in our region of space. The question I asked was simple. Who else received the Velarath distress signal? The answer came back in 14 hours. 31 spacefaring civilizations had detected the signal. Their names were listed in the relay log with the cool indifference of a system that simply records what happens and does not editorialize about it. The Cellin Directorate. The Marsh Collective, the Vundori hegemony. Civilizations so old that their histories made human civilization look like something that happened last Tuesday. Star-spanning empires with fleets that could have crossed the distance to Velarath in days. None of them had responded. The relay log included their official replies, where they had given them. I read each one. The Selen Directorate cited the absence of a mutual defense treaty with the Velarath. The Marsh Collective had flagged the signal as unverified and requested secondary confirmation before authorizing any action. The Vundori hegemony had submitted the situation to the Galactic Council for review. The estimated time for that review to conclude was 14 to 22 standard cycles. The Velarath had been sending their signal for 8 months. I closed the relay log and sat with that information for a while. Outside the viewport, the stars slid past in the long, silent procession of faster-than-light travel. Not the light-streaked blur that films always showed, but a deep, steady dark with bright points that moved slowly if you watched them long enough. 14 to 22 cycles. That was how long it took 31 advanced civilizations to agree that a dying people deserved a response. We had launched in 11 days, with 3 ships and weapons designed for rocks, because a junior analyst had stayed up all night running decryption models and refused to believe that silence was the right answer. I wrote in my log that night. I do not usually write in logs, but I wrote that night. Maybe the difference is that we still remember being afraid of the dark. Velarath Prime appeared on our long-range sensors 3 days before we arrived, and what those sensors showed us was not good. 2 of the planet's moons showed fresh impact scarring, the kind left by sustained kinetic bombardment, rocks or metal driven from orbit at speeds that turned solid ground into something temporary. Several orbital platforms were reading as destroyed or non-functional. The planet's surface itself showed bloom signatures that Dr. Okoro identified, and then went very quiet for a moment before she confirmed out loud. Kinetic strikes, multiple, targeting what appeared to be population centers. Someone had been hitting these people from space. Methodically, patiently, the way you hit something when you are not in a hurry because you know it cannot hit back. We dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system and immediately had 14 warships on our sensors. Haruto looked at the display for a moment, then he looked at me. He did not say anything, which was how I knew he was doing the math the same way I was. The attackers were the Rakthari Expanse. Fen had pulled everything our database held on them during the transit, a predatory expansionist civilization that operated on the kind of logic that is very simple and very terrible. Find a species approaching interstellar capability, strike before they can become a threat, take their resources. They had done it 12 times across 3 centuries. They were very practiced at it. They had never, as far as our records showed, been stopped. I opened a communication channel to the planet's surface. What came back was fragmented, distorted by the damage to their communication infrastructure, and in a language that Fen spent 20 minutes working through before she could render it into something I could understand. When she did, her voice was careful in the way voices get when they are carrying something heavy. The being she translated for me, the Velarath commander, whom the crew began to call the Elder because the translator struggled with their actual title, told us what we already suspected. The Rakthari had issued an ultimatum. Surrender the planet and its mineral rights, or the bombardment would resume within 72 hours and would not stop. The Velarath had contacted the Galactic Council. The Council had acknowledged their situation and recommended peaceful negotiation. The Rakthari did not negotiate. Everyone knew this. The Council knew this. You received our signal? The Elder asked, through Fen's translation. Yes, I said. A long pause. Why did you come? I thought about it for a moment. Not because the answer was complicated. Because I wanted to say it right. Because you asked, I said. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that I wondered if the translation had failed. Then the Elder said something to Fen that she translated slowly, like she was still working out whether she had it right. They did not expect that answer, she said quietly. I think most of the civilizations they have interacted with have taught them to expect conditions. I called my command staff together in the beacon. Meridians. Briefing room. I laid out the numbers without softening them. 14 Rakthari warships, 3 human survey frigates, one of which had weapon systems originally installed to push asteroids off collision courses with mining stations. No reinforcements coming, no authorization from any governing body, no tactical playbook for this situation, because no one had written one, because no one had ever been in it before. Haruto said what everyone was thinking. This is insane, Commander. Yes, I agreed. You're going to do it anyway. We are going to do it anyway, I said, and here is how. What I had was not firepower. What I had was something different, and older, and in its own way more dangerous. I had a crew that had grown up in a species that had been fighting, in one form or another, since before it had language. Humanity had not invented war, but we had spent so long at it, in so many different conditions, against so many different opponents, with so many different weapons and so many different stakes, that we had developed something the Rakthari almost certainly had not encountered in their 12 conquests. We were unpredictable. The plan I laid out operated on three things. First, surprise. Not the surprise of ambush, but the surprise of an opponent who simply does not know what you are, or what you are willing to do. The Rakthari had never fought humans. They did not have a model for us. Second, noise. Humans fight loud and complicated and in ways that are difficult to read from the outside, because we have learned that confusion is its own weapon. Third, the specific, stubborn genius of people who have been solving impossible problems with inadequate resources for as long as anyone can remember. Haruto recalibrated our mass drivers, the asteroid deterrence weapons, not to fire at the Rakthari ships directly, but to seed their primary approach vector with high-velocity debris. Not enough to destroy, enough to force recalculation. Shields on warships that size were calibrated against energy weapons and direct projectiles. No one calibrated them against what was essentially a very fast, very dense cloud of junk, because no one used mass drivers that way. It was not elegant. But elegant was not what the situation asked for. Brick Waldzak did something that he described to me afterward as mildly inadvisable but technically within engineering tolerances. He rerouted power from the Cascade's secondary drive systems in a pattern that caused the ship's sensor signature to multiply, not dramatically, not enough to fool a careful analysis, but enough to read as ambiguous. 3 ships that might be more than 3 ships, coming from a direction the Rakthari were not watching because they had not been watching anything. No one had ever challenged them before. Fen Okoro, the civilian who was not trained for combat, spent 4 hours with the Rakthari targeting network that she had quietly accessed during the communication window and found a vulnerability in their coordination protocol, a timing gap between targeting confirmation and firing authorization that existed because the system had been designed for coordinated fleet action and had never been stress-tested against something that did not coordinate the way they expected. She closed that gap from our end, not by blocking it, but by flooding it with microsecond interference that caused each ship's targeting system to question its own data. She told me about it afterward, almost apologetically. When you spend your whole career learning how other minds work, she said, you also learn the places where they stop working. We broadcast on all Rakthari frequencies before we engaged, in their own language, using the translation algorithms Fen had built during the crossing. My message was short because short was what the moment asked for. This system is under the protection of humanity. Withdraw, or we will engage. Their response was, and I say this without bitterness, because I had expected it, laughter. The Rakthari commander sent back a reply that Fen translated with her expression carefully neutral. He had never heard of humanity. 3 ships were not a threat. 3 ships were barely worth the energy of a formal response. Good, I told Haruto. I was hoping they would say that. He looked at me. Why? Because scared people are predictable, I said, and underestimated people are dangerous. We fought them for 6 hours. I will not pretend it was clean or easy, or that we were never afraid. Haruto's hands were steady on his board for every minute of it, and I never once saw them shake, but afterward, in the quiet, I saw him sit down very carefully, the way people sit when their legs have decided to be honest about how the rest of them felt. The Cascade took damage to her port side in the 3rd hour that Brick repaired with what he later described as ingenuity and profanity in approximately equal measure. We lost 2 crew members. I will carry their names for the rest of my life, and I will not write them here, because they deserve more than a line in a report. But at the end of 6 hours, 2 Rakthari warships were disabled. 1 was destroyed. The remaining 11 were, for the first time in 3 centuries of conquest, confused. They could not locate us accurately. They could not predict our movements. They could not coordinate their responses because their targeting network kept questioning itself. They were facing something that did not fight the way anything they had ever fought, and in the gap between what they expected and what we were doing, something very old happened to them. They recalculated. The Rakthari withdrew. Not because we had beaten them, 11 ships against 3, they could have beaten us. But they withdrew, because confusion, for a species that had never needed to adapt, was more threatening than firepower. They did not know what we were. They did not know what we would do next. And they were wise enough, or afraid enough to understand that an opponent you cannot model is an opponent worth avoiding. They left the Velarath system at 0340 hours, station time, 72 hours after their ultimatum. I sat in my chair on the Meridian's 1st bridge and watched their signatures fade from the sensor display, and for a long moment, no one said anything. Then Brick's voice came over the comm from engineering. "Commander, we still have a ship." "We do," I said. "Mildly surprising," he said, and signed off. 3 days after the battle, the Galactic Council's official response to the Velarath distress signal arrived. It was a formal recommendation to establish a fact-finding committee to assess intervention options. I forwarded them our after-action report and said nothing else. I had thought about what to say, and everything I considered was either too long or too sharp, and in the end, the facts were enough. The facts were, honestly, more than enough. The Council was not pleased with us. The formal communication they sent made that very clear. Humanity had acted without sanction. We had intervened in a non-aligned system. We had engaged a member state of a recognized interstellar government without authorization from any governing body. There were procedures. There were protocols. There were frameworks, carefully constructed over thousands of years of interstellar diplomacy, designed specifically to manage situations exactly like this one. I read their communication twice. Then I wrote my response. I told them that I had read every procedure, every protocol, every framework. I told them I had read them during the crossing, with 6.4 light-years of empty space ahead of me and 11 weeks to fill. I told them that I understood exactly what we had broken and why. And I told them this. 31 civilizations had the capability to respond, and 0 had responded. We had 3 ships that had no business surviving what they survived, and a xenolinguist who would never officially receive credit for saving more lives than I could count, because she had technically never been cleared for the operation she performed. I told them that they could sanction us, they could impose consequences. They could call what we did reckless, procedurally invalid, diplomatically destabilizing, and a violation of frameworks it had taken centuries to build. I was prepared to accept all of that. What I was not prepared to accept, I told them, was a galaxy where the distress call is the formality and the silence is the answer. I sent the message and did not wait for a reply. The elder asked to speak with me privately the evening before we prepared to leave. The conversation went through Fen, slowly, with several stops while she worked through concepts that did not map cleanly between our languages. The elder told me that among the Velarath's oldest stories there was a figure, a being from outside the known world, who came without being summoned, or rather, who came precisely because they were summoned, because the call was enough, because no additional justification was required. The Velarath had stopped believing in that figure a long time ago. The universe, as they had experienced it, had taught them that help always came with conditions, or did not come at all. We thought those were children's stories. Fen translated, her voice quieter than usual. We thought the universe had corrected us out of them. You have made us wonder if we were wrong to let them go. I did not know what to say to that, so I said the only thing that felt honest. We were just the ones who picked up the call. The elder said something else. Fen smiled very slightly before she translated it. They say yes, but you picked it up. I wrote my final debrief on the transit home. It was long and detailed and covered everything that needed to be covered in the official record. But at the end, after the tactical assessments and the crew evaluations and the formal recommendations, I wrote something that was not required, and that I suspect will be edited out before the document reaches anyone important. I wrote it anyway. 31 civilizations heard them call out. I have asked myself many times since that morning what made us different. Maybe it is because we are young and have not yet learned to be careful in the way that very old species are careful. Maybe it is because we come from a history so full of conflict that fear no longer stops us the way it stops beings who have been safe for 50,000 years. Or maybe it is simpler than that. Maybe it is because every one of us, somewhere in the long memory of our species, has been the one in the dark, sending out a call, hoping that something on the other end would hear it and choose to come. We know what that waiting feels like. We remember what it meant when someone came, and we remember what it cost when they did not. I am a soldier. I do not have a philosopher's answer. What I have is this. They called. We came. And somewhere behind us, 31 civilizations are writing careful reports explaining why they did not. I know which ones I would rather be.